The air in the precinct's main briefing room was a toxic cocktail, a sharp, sterile miasma of industrial bleach, stale coffee, and the cloying sweetness of cheap air freshener failing to mask the underlying scent of human desperation. It was a room built for pronouncements, for the projection of authority. A massive, polished oak podium stood at its head like the altar of some grim, bureaucratic religion. Behind it, the city's emblem was emblazoned on the wall, its gold leaf catching the merciless glare of the overhead fluorescent lights, which hummed a low, monotonous drone, a sound that burrowed into the skull and set teeth on edge. Banks of cameras were clustered at the back, a thicket of lenses and black metal, their operators shifting with a predatory restlessness. This was not just a briefing. It was a performance. At the center of this brewing storm of media and ambition stood Detective Inspector Valerius Drake. He was a man sculpted from ego, his posture ramrod straight, his suit tailored so precisely it seemed shrink-wrapped to his athletic frame. His jaw was a testament to geometric severity, his hair a lacquered, raven-black helmet. He moved with a theatrical deliberation, adjusting his crimson silk tie, his cufflinks flashing like distant distress signals. He was the star of this show, the conquering hero about to deliver the final triumphant monologue in the messy drama of the songbird slaying, a case that had held the city in a vice grip of fear for 3 agonizing weeks. Drake's smile was a thin, predatory slash, a practiced expression of confident control that did not for a single moment touch the cold, calculating depths of his eyes. He was savoring this. Every lens, every microphone, every expectant face was a mirror reflecting the image he loved most. Himself, victorious. In the far corner of the room, almost swallowed by the shadows that the harsh lighting could not quite banish, sat Arthur Finch. He was the antithesis of Drake in every conceivable way. Where Drake was a monument to sharp angles and polished surfaces, Arthur was a study in soft, frayed edges. His coat, a once respectable tweed, was rumpled and stained, hanging from his slumped shoulders like a shroud. His silver hair was a chaotic mess, falling over a face etched with the kind of profound weariness that went far beyond mere fatigue. A tremor, fine but persistent, ran through his left hand, a detail that most observers, if they noticed him at all, would instantly and dismissively categorize. Drunk, vagrant. A piece of human detritus washed up by the tide of the investigation, significant only because he had been the one to stumble upon the final, tragic scene. He had been brought here as a material witness, a formality, and was now left to fester in a hard plastic chair, an inconvenient footnote in Drake's grand narrative. Arthur's gaze was unfocused, directed at a point on the scuffed linoleum floor. He was not looking at Drake, nor at the hungry press corps. He was listening, not just to the ambient noise of the room, but to the echoes of the crime itself, echoes that resonated in his mind with a clarity that was both a gift and a curse. The smell of the room, the hum of the lights, the subtle shift of weight from the police officers flanking the doors, it all fed into a vast, intricate mental tapestry. He saw the patterns others missed, the subtle dissonances in the symphony of facts. And in the confident, booming narrative that Detective Inspector Drake was about to present, Arthur could already hear a chord of catastrophic falsehood. He remained silent, a stone of stillness in the churning water, his quiet presence a stark, unnoticed rebellion against the slick, confident fiction that was about to be peddled as truth. He was a forgotten variable in an equation Drake thought he had already solved. Drake tapped the microphone and the sound boomed through the room like a gavel, silencing the low murmur of anticipation. The effect was instantaneous. A hush fell, thick and expectant. The camera lights intensified, painting his face in a stark, unforgiving glare. He leaned forward, his voice a low, dramatic rumble. "For 3 weeks," he began, letting the words hang in the air, "this city has been haunted. Haunted by a shadow, a predator who targeted the innocent, the talented. The media has called him the songbird slayer. We simply called him our priority." He paused, a master of the dramatic beat, letting the weight of his department's supposed burden settle upon the room. He projected an image of tireless, sleepless nights, of a personal crusade waged on behalf of a terrified populace. He continued, his voice rising in volume and confidence, outlining the case with broad, simplistic strokes. He painted a picture of a suspect, a disgruntled ex-lover, driven by jealousy and rage. It was a classic, textbook motive, the kind that was easy for the public to digest and for a prosecutor to sell to a jury. He held up a photograph of a young man, his face pixelated into anonymity for the cameras but clear to those in the room. "We have our man," Drake declared, the words cracking like a whip of finality. Evidence found at the scene, combined with a history of domestic disputes, points to a crime of passion, a tragic but ultimately simple resolution to a horrifying series of events. The narrative was clean, it was tidy, and it was utterly, fundamentally wrong. From his corner, Arthur Finch shifted. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but it was the first sign of life he had shown. He lifted his head, and for the first time, his eyes focused, not on the floor, but directly on the large evidence board behind Drake. On it were photographs, timelines, and diagrams, a constellation of data meant to overwhelm and convince. But Arthur's gaze latched onto a single innocuous detail, a small, mud-stained photograph of a woman's shoe, lying several feet from the primary scene. It was listed on the board as incidental debris. Incidental. The word was a clang of dissonance in the otherwise smooth melody of Drake's theory. A low sound escaped Arthur's lips. It was not a word, but a rough, guttural noise, born of deep-seated frustration. It was the sound of a master craftsman seeing a novice use a priceless chisel as a crowbar. He pushed himself slowly, unsteadily to his feet. The plastic chair scraped against the floor, a raw, ugly sound that cut through Drake's polished oration. Every head in the room swiveled. The forest of cameras swung in unison, their lenses refocusing like the compound eyes of a single, massive insect. Who was this? This disheveled, trembling man who dared to interrupt the city's most important policeman at his moment of triumph? Drake stopped mid-sentence, his face a mask of incredulous fury. His eyes narrowed into slits of pure venom. "Do we have a problem here?" he snarled, his voice dripping with condescension. He gestured dismissively at Arthur. "Someone get this gentleman some water, or perhaps show him the door. His part in this is over." Two uniformed officers began to move toward Arthur, their expressions a mixture of annoyance and embarrassment. But Arthur did not sit. He did not shrink back into the shadows. He raised his trembling hand, not in a threat, but as a plea for attention. His voice, when it came, was a hoarse, gravelly whisper, slurred by more than just disuse. "The shoe," he rasped, the words clumsy, fighting their way past lips that seemed unused to forming them. "The mud on the shoe. It's wrong." Laughter. It started as a snort from one of the detectives standing near Drake. Then it bloomed, a wave of derisive, incredulous mirth that rolled through the assembled officers. The press, sensing blood in the water, began murmuring, their microphones leaning in closer. Drake's face, which had been tight with anger, relaxed into a cruel, mocking smile. He saw an opportunity not just to dismiss, but to utterly annihilate. "The shoe," he repeated, his voice booming with theatrical disbelief. He turned to the press, a smirk playing on his lips. "Ladies and gentlemen, it appears we have a consulting detective in our midst, a connoisseur of muddy footwear." The laughter grew louder, sharper. The soil type," Arthur pressed on, his voice strained, his body swaying slightly. He looked for all the world like a drunk man clinging to the last vestiges of a nonsensical argument. "It's alluvial clay, rich in ferrous oxide, reddish tint. The crime scene is on limestone karst. Gray, alkaline soil, two different geologies. The shoe, it wasn't from there, it was planted. He spoke in broken fragments, his mind moving far faster than his tongue could keep up, the neurological misfire between his brain and his mouth turning his brilliant deduction into what sounded like the ramblings of a madman. Drake's face was a study in theatrical pity. He shook his head slowly as if dealing with a recalcitrant child. Planted? Son, have you been drinking this morning? Or is it still last night? He gestured to the officers who had now reached Arthur. All right, that's enough of the floor show. Get him out of here. We have actual police work to discuss. The officers took Arthur's arms, their grips firm but not yet violent. They were embarrassed for him, for the department. This was the moment of injustice, sharp and public. The humiliation was absolute. Arthur Finch, a man whose mind was a national treasure, was being physically removed, dismissed as a drunk, his crucial insight tossed aside like trash. The cameras flashed, capturing his face, contorted not with anger, but with a deep, profound sorrow. The sorrow of a man who held the key to a lock everyone else insisted was already open. As they began to pull him away, his eyes met Drake's. There was no fear in them, no pleading. There was only a calm, unnerving certainty. "You're looking at the frame," Arthur said, his voice suddenly clearer, colder. "Not the picture." The words, though quiet, landed in the charged atmosphere with the weight of prophecy. Drake merely scoffed, turning his back on the old man, dismissing him from his reality. He raised his hands to the press, a gesture of, "Let us continue." His victory momentarily interrupted, but now all the sweeter. He had not just presented his case, he had vanquished a fool, or so he thought. The heavy door of the briefing room slammed shut behind Arthur, the sound a dull, final thud. The officers, their faces etched with a mixture of professional duty and personal discomfort, guided him down a long, sterile corridor. The fluorescent lights above hummed a monotonous, soul-crushing tune, the same oppressive frequency as in the briefing room. But here, in the narrow confines of the hallway, the sound felt more like a physical pressure. The walls were painted a pale, institutional green, the color of resignation. They led him not to a holding cell but to a small, windowless room designated for interviews. An interrogation room. The distinction was subtle but significant. A cell was for criminals. An interrogation room was for breaking people. "Wait in here," one of the officers grunted, his voice devoid of emotion. He gestured to a single metal chair bolted to the floor. A matching metal table was bolted down before it. The room was a cube of cold, hard surfaces. It smelled of stale sweat and fear. The officer's partner, a younger man with unease flickering in his eyes, lingered for a moment at the door. "Inspector Drake will want a word with you later," he added, as if it were a threat. It was. Drake was not content with public humiliation. He needed to grind the source of his irritation into dust to ensure this ragged old man understood the price of questioning his authority. The door clicked shut, and the lock engaged with a heavy, metallic clang. Arthur was alone. He stood for a long moment in the center of the small room, the tremor in his hand now more pronounced. He did not move toward the chair. Instead, he closed his eyes, his whole body seeming to sag, as if the strings holding him upright had been loosened. The public performance was over. Now, in the suffocating quiet, the full weight of his reality descended upon him. The slurred speech, the unsteadiness, the tremor. They were not the hallmarks of alcohol. They were the ghosts of a firefight from 2 decades ago, the shrapnel that had carved a path through his temporal lobe, leaving a brilliant mind trapped inside a body that sometimes refused its commands. A body that, under stress, betrayed him, presenting the world with a caricature of a drunk. He had learned to live with it, to manage it. But after Eleanor had died, after the light of his life had been extinguished by a sickness far more relentless than any criminal he had ever pursued, the fight had gone out of him. The meticulous regimen of medication and physical therapy had given way to a quiet, consuming grief. He had let the edges fray. He had stopped caring what the world saw. He had welcomed the anonymity of being a ghost, a relic, until today. Until he had knelt by the body of that young woman, the victim they called the Songbird, and had seen the signature. Not the killer's signature, but the signature of the scene itself. It was a language he understood better than his own native tongue, and it screamed a single word: deception. Meanwhile, back in the hallway, the younger officer, Detective Miller, leaned against the wall, his stomach churning. He was new to the homicide division, promoted on the back of a commendation for his obsessive attention to detail. He idolized the legends, the old-timers who were spoken of in hushed, reverent tones at the academy, men who could solve a case with a glance, who saw the world in a way others could not. Drake was not one of them. Drake was a politician with a badge, a master of press conferences and internal maneuvering. Miller replayed the old man's words in his head. Alluvial clay. Limestone karst. The shoe was planted. It sounded like nonsense, the ramblings of a drunk. But the old man's eyes, there had been no madness in them. Miller had seen a flicker of something else, a piercing analytical fire, a blazing intelligence that had been momentarily visible through the fog of his physical state. On a hunch, a stupid, career-endangering hunch, Miller slipped away from his post. He walked quickly to the evidence locker, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. He signed out the evidence file for the Songbird case, citing a need to re-verify chain of custody, a flimsy excuse, but one that would hold for an hour or two. He took the file to a small, forgotten cubicle in the records department, a place that smelled of decaying paper and dust. He spread the contents across the desk. He found the preliminary geological survey from the crime scene. Just as the old man had said, a thin layer of topsoil over a massive deposit of limestone karst. Gray, alkaline. Then he found the detailed analysis of the items logged as incidental debris. He flipped to the report on the victim's shoe, the one found 20 feet away. The lab report was brief. It noted the shoe type, the brand, the size, and then a single line in the soil analysis section. Trace soil evidence consistent with ferrous oxide-rich clay, non-native to recovery site. Miller's breath caught in his throat. It was there, in plain black and white. A detail so small, so seemingly insignificant that everyone, including the lead forensics team, had overlooked it. Or, perhaps, had been encouraged to overlook it in the rush to embrace Drake's simple, elegant theory. The old man was right. The soil didn't match. The shoe hadn't just fallen off there. It had been brought from somewhere else. It was a piece of a different puzzle. Drake's neat narrative, his case against the ex-lover, had just been fractured, and the man who had fractured it was sitting in an interrogation room, about to be threatened into silence by the very detective whose career he could now destroy. A cold dread washed over Miller. This was more than just a mistake. This was a willful blindness, an act of ego so profound it was leading to the conviction of a potentially innocent man while the real killer remained free. He had to do something. But what? Going to Drake was suicide. Going to the chief was little better. The chief was Drake's political sponsor. He felt a surge of panic, the cold certainty of a man standing at a precipice, knowing he had to jump. Then he remembered something else the old man had said. As the officers had first approached him, as Drake was mocking him, the man had muttered something under his breath so quiet Miller had barely caught it. It had sounded like gibberish. Labyrinth. 7. Tell them. Labyrinth. It meant nothing. A drunk's free association. But now, in the context of the soil report, it felt different. It felt like a key. A password. Miller's mind raced. Labyrinth. Where had he heard that before? It was an old case, a ghost story they told at the academy. The Labyrinth Killer. a serial murderer from the 90s who had been caught by a shadowy, almost mythical analyst, a man who had no name, no face, just a legend. A profiler so brilliant they said he could reconstruct a man's soul from the dust left on his shoes. With trembling fingers, Miller logged into the secure internal network, using a clearance level he wasn't technically supposed to have access to, but had acquired through a friendly IT tech. He typed "labyrinth" into the deep archive search. The file was heavily redacted. Most of it was classified above top secret, but one small, unredacted annex was available. Protocol 7. It was a short, cryptic directive. In the event of direct, verifiable contact from Operative Daedalus, retired, all resources of this department and affiliated national agencies are to be placed at his immediate and unconditional disposal. Authentication. The Labyrinth. Daedalus, the master craftsman of Greek myth who built the original labyrinth. It was a code name. The old man in the interrogation room. The tremor. The slurred speech. The encyclopedic knowledge of soil geology. The piercing eyes. It all clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. He was not a drunk. He was Daedalus. He was Arthur Finch. And he had just invoked Protocol 7. Miller felt a surge of adrenaline that was part terror, part exhilaration. He was a junior detective holding a lit stick of dynamite. He looked at the bottom of the Protocol 7 directive. There was a single contact number. Not for the precinct, not for the city police, not even for the FBI. It was a number with a Washington, D.C. area code, listed only as Directorate. His hand shook as he picked up the secure-lined phone on the desk, the one reserved for national security alerts. His career in this city was over, one way or another. He took a deep, shuddering breath and dialed the number. He was about to make a call that would bring the wrath of gods and monsters down upon the head of Inspector Valerius Drake. Inside the interrogation room, Arthur had finally lowered himself into the cold metal chair. He stared at his own reflection in the polished surface of the table. A ghost stared back, a man he barely recognized. He let his mind drift, not as an escape, but as a tool. He was rebuilding the crime, not the one Drake had invented, but the real one. He let the sensory data wash over him. The victim's perfume, a faint lily-of-the-valley scent he'd noticed at the scene, still clinging to the air around him like a memory. The specific pattern of the blood spatter, which spoke not of a frenzied, passionate attack, but of a cold, methodical execution. And the shoe, the red clay. His mind flew back 20 years to a damp, root-choked cellar in Baltimore. The air had been thick with the smell of earth and decay. This was the lair of the Labyrinth Killer, a man who had terrorized the East Coast for a decade. Arthur had been there, a younger man then, but already bearing the scars that would one day define his physical state. He remembered seeing the same reddish clay caked on the killer's boots, a specific type found only in the riverbeds north of the city. It had been the key, the tiny detail that had unraveled a web of unimaginable complexity. The killer had been a geologist, a man who used his knowledge of the earth to bury his victims where they would never be found. He had used the earth as his accomplice. The songbird killer was doing the same, but differently. He wasn't using geology to hide. He was using it to mislead. The planted shoe was a deliberate misdirection, a piece of theatrical staging designed to send the police down a rabbit hole. It was a signature of intellectual arrogance. The killer was not just murdering his victims. He was playing a game with his pursuers. He was mocking them, and Valerius Drake, in his own towering arrogance, had not only failed to see the game, he had picked up the wrong pieces and declared himself the winner. Arthur felt a wave of profound sadness. A young woman was dead, an innocent man was about to be condemned, and a monster was out there, watching, and almost certainly laughing. He closed his eyes. He had given Miller the key. Now, all he could do was wait and see if the young man had the courage to use it. The silence in the room was absolute, the silence of a held breath, the pause between a lightning flash and the inevitable, world-shaking thunder. The call from Detective Miller's secure line did not land in a noisy call center or a bureaucratic queue. It bypassed all standard channels, routed by the cryptic string of digits to a single, silent device. The phone sat on a vast, uncluttered desk of obsidian black granite in an office that overlooked the entire sprawling panorama of Washington, D.C. It did not ring. It chimed, a single, low, resonant tone that cut through the soundproofed quiet of the room with the urgency of a cardiac alarm. Director General Thorne, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard decisions and sleepless nights, did not even flinch. He had not heard that specific chime in over a decade. He calmly placed the document he was reviewing back onto his desk, its edges perfectly aligned with the corner of his leather blotter. He picked up the receiver. "Thorne," he said, his voice a quiet baritone that carried an implicit, unshakable authority. On the other end, Detective Miller's voice was a nervous, high-pitched tremor. "Sir, my name is Detective Miller, from the city police. I don't know if this is the right number, but I was given a protocol." "Which protocol, Detective?" Thorne's voice remained unnervingly calm, but his eyes, the color of chips of ice, sharpened. His entire posture became a study in focused intensity. "Protocol 7, sir," Miller stammered, the words tumbling out in a rush. "And a name. 2 names, Labyrinth and Daedalus." Silence. For a full 5 seconds, the only sound on the line was the frantic thumping of Miller's own heart, which he was sure the man on the other end could somehow hear. Then Thorne spoke again, and all traces of calm detachment were gone. His voice was now forged from cold, hard steel. "Detective Miller, what is the current status of Operative Daedalus?" He's here, sir, at the precinct. He's being detained." Miller's voice cracked on the last word. "My commanding officer, he thinks he's a drunk. He's being held for obstruction." A muscle in Thorne's jaw clenched so hard it was audible. The quiet fury that emanated from him was more terrifying than any shout. "He is being detained?" The words were spoken with a precision that was lethally sharp. "By whom?" "Detective Inspector Valerius Drake, sir," Miller said, feeling as though he were pronouncing a man's eulogy. "Stay where you are, Detective," Thorne commanded. "Do not engage with Inspector Drake. Do not return to your post. Await my arrival. Your career is not over. It has just begun." The line went dead. Thorne stood up, his movements economical and swift. He pressed a single red button on his console. Within seconds, the door to his office opened and his aide, a severe-looking woman in a crisp military-style uniform, stepped in. "Sir?" "Mobilize the Aegis team," Thorne ordered, his voice leaving no room for questions. "Full-dress uniform, asset retrieval protocols. Destination, City Central Precinct. I want a flight plan cleared and a motorcade on the tarmac in 10 minutes. And get me everything, and I mean everything, on a municipal detective named Valerius Drake. I want to know what brand of toothpaste he uses by the time we land." The aide's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. The Aegis team was the Directorate's elite internal affairs and special operations unit, a force of federal marshals and intelligence officers reserved for situations of catastrophic institutional failure or national security compromise. To deploy them in full-dress uniform to a civilian police precinct was not just an action, it was a statement. It was an invasion. "Sir," she said, her voice crisp, "authentication?" Thorne looked his aide dead in the eye. "The labyrinth is open," he said, "and Daedalus is trapped inside." That was all she needed to hear. She spun on her heel and departed, the order already cascading through secure channels, setting into motion a chain of events that would move with the speed and unstoppable force of a tidal wave. For Director General Thorne, this was not just a procedural matter. Arthur Finch was not just an operative. He was a mentor, a legend, the man who had taught Thorne everything he knew about seeing the truth when all the world saw was chaos. To hear that he was being detained, humiliated, mistaken for a common drunk by some arrogant, tin-pot detective. It was an insult of such profound magnitude that it demanded a response that would be remembered for a generation. The city and Inspector Drake were about to learn what happened when you poked a sleeping god with a stick. Back at the precinct, Valerius Drake was riding a wave of pure adrenaline. He had masterfully handled the interruption from the old drunk. He had turned it into a moment of personal triumph, a demonstration of his unflappable control. He was now fielding questions from the press, his answers smooth, confident, and utterly devoid of substance. He was a portrait of success, a man at the absolute apex of his power, basking in the warm glow of public adoration and imminent victory. He was so caught up in his own performance that he failed to notice the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The first sign was a low, distant thrumming, a sound that seemed to come from the very sky above the building. It grew steadily louder, a rhythmic, percussive chopping that was not the familiar sound of a news helicopter. Then the ground itself seemed to vibrate. The building's windows rattled in their frames. Outside, the sounds of the city, the traffic, the sirens, the noise of daily life, were abruptly swallowed by the roar of approaching engines and the squeal of tires. The reporters in the back of the room began to murmur, their attention shifting from Drake to the chaos erupting outside. Phones buzzed with alerts from their news desks. Something major was happening, and then the doors to the briefing room burst open. They did not swing open gently. They were thrown wide with a percussive blast of force that made the entire room jump. Two figures stood silhouetted in the doorway. They were not police officers. They were immense, imposing men in charcoal-gray dress uniforms that were immaculately pressed, adorned with decorations that spoke of service in places far beyond the city limits. They wore no hats, but their expressions were as hard and unyielding as granite. They held themselves with an unnatural stillness, their eyes scanning the room with a cold, professional assessment that missed nothing. They were the honor guard for what was to come. Behind them, a procession entered. It was a slow, measured, and utterly intimidating display. A dozen more figures, all in the same severe uniforms, filed into the room and formed two perfect lines along the side walls, facing inward. Their movements were synchronized, their footsteps falling with a rhythmic, hypnotic cadence that sounded like the marching of a firing squad. The air crackled with an authority so absolute it was suffocating. Every camera, every eye in the room was now fixed on this silent, terrifying intrusion. The press was stunned into silence. The local police officers, including the ones who had been flanking Drake, seemed to shrink, their own authority dissolving in the face of this overwhelming presence. Finally, through the path cleared by his soldiers, Director General Thorne entered the room. He was not a large man, but he possessed a gravitational pull that bent the entire atmosphere around him. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, his icy eyes sweeping over the room before landing, with laser-like precision, on the man at the podium. Valerius Drake stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, his confident smile having evaporated into a mask of slack-jawed confusion. Who were these people? What federal agency had he offended? This was not the FBI. This was not the ATF. This was something else entirely, something older and far more dangerous. He felt a primal jolt of fear, the kind an animal feels when it realizes the shadow passing over it is not a cloud, but the wing of a hawk. "Can I help you?" Drake managed to stammer, his voice a pathetic squeak that was swallowed by the cavernous silence. Thorne did not answer. He did not even acknowledge Drake's existence. He walked past the podium as if it, and the man standing behind it, were nothing more than pieces of furniture. His gaze was fixed on the far side of the room, on the door to the hallway that led to the interrogation rooms. He stopped in the center of the floor and turned to one of his men, a captain with a face that looked like it had been carved from a block of wood. "Bring him," Thorne said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. The captain nodded once, then he and another Aegis officer moved with silent efficiency toward the door. The remaining uniformed officers stood like statues, their presence a silent, suffocating judgment upon the entire precinct. Drake, bypassed and ignored, felt a hot flush of rage mixed with his fear. "I am Detective Inspector Drake," he announced, trying to reclaim some shred of his shattered authority. "This is my investigation. Who in the hell are you?" This time, Thorne turned his head slowly, his gaze so cold it was a physical force. He looked at Drake, truly looked at him, and what Drake saw in those eyes made his blood run cold. It was not anger. It was a look of profound, almost surgical contempt. "Your investigation," Thorne said, his voice flat, "is over." Just then, the door from the hallway opened again. The Aegis captain re-entered, holding the door for the man who followed. It was Arthur Finch. He looked bewildered, his rumpled clothes and unsteady gait a stark contrast to the rigid formality of the men who now flanked him protectively. He was blinking in the sudden bright lights of the cameras, which had all swiveled to capture this new, bizarre development. Thorne's entire demeanor changed. The icy hardness melted away, replaced by something that looked like profound, heartfelt respect. He walked directly to Arthur, stopping a respectful distance away. He ignored the cameras, the shocked reporters, the local police. He ignored Valerius Drake, who was now watching this scene unfold with a dawning, sickening horror. Director General Thorne drew himself up to his full height. In the dead, silent room, filled with high-ranking officers and federal agents, he executed a sharp, formal, and deeply respectful bow from the waist. It was not a salute. It was a gesture of deference, an act of homage one might offer to a king. "Mr. Finch," Thorne said, his voice resonating with genuine emotion. "It is an honor. I apologize for the delay. We came as soon as we heard." The room erupted in a cacophony of clicking camera shutters. The sight of this powerful, commanding figure bowing to the disheveled old man was so surreal, so utterly incomprehensible, that it short-circuited the brain. Drake felt the floor drop out from under him. The blood drained from his face, leaving him with a pasty, waxen complexion. His mind was a maelstrom of confusion and terror. What was happening? Who was this old man? Thorne straightened up and turned to face the stunned assembly. His voice, no longer quiet, now boomed with an authority that dwarfed anything Drake had produced. "For the benefit of those present, and for the record," he began, his tone formal and declamatory, "allow me to introduce the man you have so grievously insulted. This is Mr. Arthur Finch. To the world, he is a ghost, a myth, but to the intelligence community of this nation, and to our allies abroad, he is known by another name, Daedalus." A wave of whispers and gasps swept through the press corps. The older reporters, the ones who had covered crime for decades, recognized the name. Daedalus, the legendary profiler, the man who had caught the Labyrinth killer, the architect of modern forensic psychology. He was supposed to be a myth, a boogeyman the FBI used to scare serial killers. But he was real, and he was standing right there, looking like a homeless man who had wandered in off the street. Thorne's gaze fell upon Drake again, and this time it was not contemptuous. It was damning. Mr. Finch is the founder of the National Forensic Analysis Directorate. His work forms the very bedrock of how we hunt the most dangerous predators on this planet. His mind has been designated a strategic national asset. As such, he is protected by Protocol 7, a directive that grants him unconditional authority and resources on any case he chooses to engage. Thorne paused, letting the weight of his words crush the air from the room. "A protocol, Inspector Drake, that you were one phone call away from being informed of, had you possessed an ounce of humility or a shred of professional curiosity." He gestured to the evidence board. "Mr. Finch, in a state of what you so callously dismissed as drunkenness, did what your entire team of so-called experts failed to do. He saw the truth. He identified the planted evidence, the geological anomaly of the soil on the shoe. He understood in an instant that you were not hunting a killer, but chasing a ghost, a fiction created by the real perpetrator to mock you. Thorne's voice dripped with ice. He tried to warn you. He tried to save you from your own catastrophic incompetence, and in response, you had him publicly humiliated and illegally detained. Drake's body began to tremble. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He was shrinking inside his perfectly tailored suit, the fabric now seeming too large, a costume for a part he was no longer qualified to play. His entire world, his career, his carefully constructed reality, was being dismantled, piece by piece in front of the very audience he had sought to impress. Therefore, Thorne declared, his voice rising to a crescendo of judgment, by the authority vested in me by the National Security Act, your command of this investigation is hereby terminated. This case is now under federal jurisdiction, and its lead consultant, he turned and gestured again to Arthur, is Mr. Arthur Finch. He then looked at the two Aegis officers standing nearest to Drake. "Captain," he said, his voice dropping to a lethal calm, "relieve Inspector Drake of his badge, his weapon, and his command. Place him under investigative arrest for obstruction of a federal inquiry and gross negligence." The two officers moved with silent, brutal efficiency. One stepped behind Drake, while the other faced him. "Sir, please place your hands on the podium," the officer said, his voice polite but unyielding. Drake, in a state of pure shock, could not move. He just stared, his eyes wide with disbelief. The officer did not repeat his request. He simply took Drake's arms, expertly spun him around, and slammed him against the podium he had commanded just moments before. The sound of his body hitting the wood echoed through the silent room. The metallic click of handcuffs being ratcheted tight was the only other sound. The public humiliation was now complete, a perfect, horrifying mirror of what he had inflicted upon Arthur. His face, once flushed with arrogant pride, was now the color of ash. He was no longer a hero. He was a prisoner. The immediate aftermath was a blur of controlled, efficient action. As Drake was being quietly but firmly escorted from the room, his face a mask of shattered disbelief, Director General Thorne addressed the stunned press corps. "This briefing is over," he announced, his voice a hammer of finality. "All further inquiries regarding the Songbird case will be directed through the Directorate's Public Affairs Office. There will be no exceptions." His Aegis team began to subtly herd the reporters and cameramen toward the exit, their imposing presence discouraging any and all argument. The show was well and truly over. Thorne turned his attention back to Arthur Finch. The old man was standing where he had been left, looking overwhelmed by the sudden, violent shift in his reality. He seemed smaller now. The fire of his earlier defiance banked, leaving only the deep, abiding weariness in his eyes. Thorne's expression softened. He walked over and placed a gentle hand on Arthur's shoulder. "Let's get you out of here, old friend," he said softly, his voice for Arthur's ears only. "You look like you could use a decent cup of coffee, and perhaps a change of clothes." Arthur looked up at the powerful man beside him, a flicker of a wry smile touching his lips. "I was rather hoping for tea," he rasped, his voice still rough. The small jest, the first spark of his old self, seemed to please Thorne immensely. He nodded, a genuine smile breaking through his severe expression. "Tea, it is," he confirmed. A cordon of Aegis officers formed around them, a moving wall of gray uniformed protection, shielding Arthur from the lingering, hungry lenses of the press who were being forced out of the building. As they walked toward the exit, they passed Detective Miller, who was standing by the wall, looking pale and terrified. Thorne paused the procession. He looked at the young detective, who flinched under his gaze. "Detective Miller," Thorne said, his voice clear and formal for all his men to hear. "You showed initiative, courage, and an unwavering commitment to the truth in the face of institutional arrogance. You placed a call that you knew could end your career, because it was the right thing to do." He extended a hand. "The Directorate and Mr. Finch are in your debt. Report to my aide in the morning. We have a position for you." Miller, looking utterly dumbfounded, shook the Director General's hand as if in a dream. He had risked everything, and in doing so had gained a future he could never have imagined. Their path then led them past the spot where Valerius Drake was being held before being transported. The former inspector was slumped between two federal officers, his head bowed, his expensive suit now looking like a cheap costume. As Arthur passed, Drake lifted his head, his eyes pleading, filled with a desperate, pathetic hope for— what? Forgiveness? An explanation? Arthur stopped. He looked at the man who had mocked him, who had tried to crush him. He saw not a monster, but a small, hollow man, inflated by ego and now utterly deflated by its loss. There was no triumph in Arthur's expression, no gloating. There was only a profound, almost tragic sadness. "You wanted to solve the crime," Arthur said, his voice quiet, yet it carried with devastating clarity in the now emptying hall. "But you were too busy trying to solve your career." He paused, letting the observation land. "The evidence is a whisper, not a shout. It doesn't applaud. It doesn't offer promotions. It simply tells the truth to anyone quiet enough to listen." With that final, devastatingly simple lesson, Arthur turned and allowed Thorne to guide him away. He did not look back. He left Valerius Drake to drown in the silence, a silence filled only with the echoes of his own hubris. Arthur was escorted out of the precinct not as a suspect or a drunk, but as the revered oracle he was, stepping out of the shadows and into the light, leaving a world of broken pride and shattered careers in his wake. The fall of Detective Inspector Valerius Drake was as swift as it was brutal. It was not merely a fall from grace, it was an obliteration. The investigative arrest for obstruction was only the beginning. Director General Thorne's agency, with its limitless resources and its long memory, descended upon Drake's career like a swarm of locusts, picking it clean to the bone. They opened his entire case history, re-examining every conviction, every closed file. What they found was a pattern. A long, sordid history of cutting corners, of ignoring contradictory evidence, of bullying witnesses, and of building cases around the most convenient suspect rather than the most likely one. The Songbird case was not an anomaly. It was the culmination of a career built on a foundation of arrogance and lies. Within 6 months, Drake was no longer a police officer. He was a convicted felon. The obstruction charge stuck, supplemented by multiple counts of perjury and evidence tampering discovered in his past cases. His pension was stripped. His commendations were formally rescinded. The press, which had once lionized him, now feasted on his carcass, running sensational headlines about the disgraced detective and the fall of a tin god. His name became a byword for corruption and incompetence at the police academy, a cautionary tale taught to every new recruit. He lost his house, his wife left him, and he vanished into the anonymity he had once so feared, a ghost haunted by the specter of the quiet old man he had tried to destroy. The systemic impact of the incident was just as profound. Spurred by the public embarrassment and the undeniable proof of failure, a massive reform swept through the city's police department. Director General Thorne, leveraging the full weight of his federal authority, oversaw the implementation of what came to be known as the Finch Protocol. It was a new, anonymous tip line and review system, managed not by the police themselves, but by an independent civilian oversight committee. It was designed to allow individuals, both civilian and law enforcement, to report critical overlooked evidence or potential misconduct without fear of reprisal from a compromised chain of command. It was a system designed to listen for the whispers, and at the head of this new initiative, handpicked by Thorne himself, was the newly minted federal agent Miller. His single act of courage had propelled him out of the stagnant pond of municipal politics and into a role of national importance. He became Thorne's protégé, learning directly from the man who had answered his desperate call, Miller shed his youthful idealism, replacing it with a hardened, practical determination to ensure that a man like Arthur Finch would never again be silenced, and a man like Valerius Drake would never again be allowed to wield power. He championed the protocol with a zealot's passion, turning it into a powerful tool for justice that would go on to overturn dozens of wrongful convictions in the years that followed. Months bled into a year. The seasons turned. The songbird killer was eventually caught, tracked down by Arthur Finch's quiet, methodical genius. It turned out to be a university professor of classical literature, a man whose arrogance was matched only by his cruelty, who believed himself intellectually superior to everyone, especially the police. He had, as Arthur suspected, planted the shoe as a game, a way to taunt the authorities he held in such contempt. He had not counted on them having Daedalus on their side. With the case closed, Arthur once again retreated from the world, but this time the retreat was different. He had moved from his squalid apartment into a small, clean cottage that Thorne's agency had arranged for him. It had a garden. He found a quiet solace in tending to the roses, his hands, still trembling but now more controlled with proper medication and care, gently pruning the thorns. He had found a measure of peace. The fire that had been banked for so long had been stirred, and it now burned with a low, steady heat. He no longer felt like a ghost. He felt like a man who had, at long last, found his way back from the wilderness of his grief. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Arthur was sitting on his porch reading a book, a figure appeared at the end of his gravel driveway. It was a man, gaunt and stooped, dressed in worn, ill-fitting clothes. He looked hesitant, broken. It took Arthur a moment to recognize him. It was Valerius Drake. He had served his time, a shortened sentence for good behavior, and was now a free man, though he looked anything but. Drake walked slowly up the path, his eyes fixed on the ground. He stopped a few feet from the porch, unable to meet Arthur's gaze. "Mr. Finch," he said, his voice a dry, cracking whisper, a hollow echo of the booming baritone he once possessed. I know you have no reason to listen to me, but I had to come. I had to say it." He finally looked up, and his eyes were filled with a raw, desperate shame. "I was wrong. About everything. I was arrogant and cruel and blind. What I did to you, and what I almost did to that innocent man, there's no excuse. I am sorry." The apology was not smooth or eloquent. It was a raw, ugly, painful thing, torn from the depths of his shattered soul. Arthur closed his book, marking his page with a finger. He regarded Drake for a long, silent moment. He did not offer absolution. He did not offer a comforting word. "An apology is a recognition of the past, Mr. Drake," Arthur said, his voice calm and even. "But it has no power to change it. Your sorrow is for yourself, for what you have lost. It is a start, but it is not the end." Drake flinched as if struck, but he nodded, accepting the truth of the words. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice pleading. "How do I fix any of it?" "You cannot," Arthur stated simply. "Some things, once broken, cannot be perfectly mended, but you can build something new." He gestured vaguely toward the world beyond his garden. "You spent a career learning how the system works, and you spent a year learning how it fails. There are men and women in prison today because of officers like you were. Men who had no one to listen to their whispers. You know the language of the frame. Use it. Find them. Fight for them." He was not offering forgiveness. He was offering a purpose, a path to a redemption that had to be earned, not given. Drake stood there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of Arthur's words settling upon him. Then, for the first time, a flicker of something other than shame appeared in his eyes. It was a glimmer of resolve. He nodded slowly, not to Arthur, but to himself. He turned without another word and walked away, his steps no longer shuffling, but imbued with a new, fragile sense of direction. Arthur watched him go, then turned his gaze back to his garden. The world was an imperfect place, filled with broken things. But sometimes, from the wreckage, something new and unexpectedly strong could grow. He picked up his book, but he did not open it. Instead, he looked at a small, unopened package on the table beside him. It was a new file sent over by Agent Miller. A cold case from 30 years ago, a puzzle no one had ever been able to solve, a whisper that had gone unheard for 3 decades. Arthur reached out, his steady hand pulling the file toward him. A small, sad but determined smile touched his lips. His work was not done. The silence was still full of secrets, waiting for someone quiet enough to listen.